For most Americans, our first experience with Islam came in 2001 with the terrorist attack of September the 11th. We begin to ask questions about, is this a religion of peace or is this a religion of terror? And in the, 15 years since then, we've continued to wrestle with those questions. We've continued to ask, what does it mean for a practicer, for a Muslim person to, what do they believe? And so I'm really excited today to begin to explore some of these questions and the interrelationship between Islam and Christianity. For me, my first experience with Islam wasn't in 2001, it was a couple years earlier, when I moved away from Rutherford County to go to college. Our freshman roommate was Bandar Ayad. His first time ever being in America from Saudi Arabia was coming to NC State as a freshman. He was a practicing Muslim. Now, I joke a lot about being from Rutherford County, about being from a small town, but one of the things that's actually true about growing up in rural western North Carolina is that you don't get to experience a lot of people from other countries. You don't get to experience the diversity that might take place at, say, a college like NC State in a city like Raleigh. And so for me, this was all new. I was having to ask questions that I'd never had to ask before. When Bandar would pull his prayer rug out and pray 5 times a day, face east and pray 5 times a day, I was having to wrestle with, what does this mean for his relationship with God? What does this mean for my own relationship with God? And so ever since then, I myself have been on a journey of asking those questions. What does it mean? What does Islam truly profess? What do people who practice this religion actually mean? So when we explore this topic today, I hope we can approach it with an open mind, with a sense of curiosity, with a sense of learning, and maybe set aside some of the things that you've heard in the past and things that maybe the news is reporting, and hear some similarities and some differences for what Christians and Muslims believe. Because I really believe that this has been true for me, and the journey that I've been on these past years to learn from this other religion, that my own faith in Jesus Christ has been strengthened. And I hope today that yours will be as well. So thank you to whoever wrote this question in for our Big Question series. And the question is a good one, maybe the best one of all. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And for me, the key word here is worship. And so we're gonna explore this topic today, look at some of the similarities between Christianity and Islam, some of the differences, and value, maybe learn something from what the Muslims have to offer us. So in order to understand something about Islam, I want to go all the way back to close to the beginning, to Abraham. Now, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam can all trace our roots back to the patriarch Abraham. If you remember God's covenant with Abraham, God calls Abraham to go, to leave the place where he was, and just to go, to be a blessing. God was going to bless Abraham so that Abraham could be a blessing to the whole world. Now, part of that calling Abraham didn't know right away, and so he's trying to figure it all out. And then God comes to him again after he's entered into this covenant. God comes to Abraham and tells Abraham to count the stars in the sky. He says, go ahead, count the stars. Your offspring are going to number more than the stars in the sky. And of course, Abraham starts to question that. He says to God, I'm 80 years old. My wife is 100 years old. This is not going to happen. There's no chance that I'll have offspring that number the stars in the sky. How is this going to happen? And God says, trust me. You will be many offspring. You'll have offspring that will number even far greater than the stars in the sky. And again, Abraham questions, but eventually God does start to begin to provide children. But before that happened, Abraham started to doubt again. And he questions God. He said, how can this happen? I'm too old to have a child. And so he and his wife Sarah they try and bypass God's plan. Remember last week we were talking about sometimes we try and carve our own path instead of letting God's plan for our lives play out. It's more of a zigzag to God than it is the straight line to God. So Abraham takes one of these paths of his own way. And he has this conversation with Sarah, his wife. And he said, we're not going to be able to have children. So Sarah asked Abraham, why don't you have a child with one of our servants, Hagar? And Hagar can provide you a child. And then we will begin to fulfill God's plan for our lives, that you will have many offspring. So they do. And Abraham's firstborn child actually is Ishmael. It's not Isaac. We tend to think, you say Abraham and Isaac, but the firstborn is actually Ishmael. And as you can imagine, as Abraham begins to have this child, Sarah and Hagar don't like each other. Sarah becomes jealous because her servant is able to provide a child where she was unable to provide a child. So they get into a fight, and Hagar flees into the wilderness. And it's at this point we're going to pick up the story in Genesis. Captain Jack's going to read that for us.
The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, that they cannot be counted for the multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction.
Thanks, Jack. So we see that Hagar is able to give firstborn son to Abraham. And as a result of this, the Muslims can trace their heritage back through Ishmael all the way to Abraham. In fact, they would claim that the Prophet Muhammad is a descendant of Ishmael coming back all the way to Abraham. Whereas we say that when we open up Matthew, the first chapter of Matthew, we see the genealogy of Jesus. And the first thing we'll see in the genealogy is that Abraham gave birth to a son, Isaac. We trace, through Jesus, we trace the lineage back through Isaac, the natural son of Abraham and Sarah. So as we're progressing through the story of God's people, we see already that we have a common heritage in Abraham. And as God's people are trying to figure out, really, how do we put what we believe to be true about God into something that we can say quickly, briefly, succinctly, and how do we describe God? And so they had the Ten Commandments. They knew that Moses had been given the law from God on Mount Sinai. And as they're wrestling with this whole idea of how do we put this into something succinct that we can believe in, they came up with this from Deuteronomy. Maybe you've heard this before as a way of describing who God is. So this is the verse that tells us, put this on your doorframe. Bind this to your foreheads. Teach your children this. If we're going to boil down what we know about God into one verse, a couple of verses, this is what it comes down to. Listen, our God is the Lord. Only the Lord. Sometimes we see this translated, there is no God but God. Or our God is only one. There is only one God. Our God is the Lord, only the Lord. And then love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. So we see from this that there's a proclamation very early on in the formation of God's people that the claim that there is only one God. This becomes foundational in understanding everything that we know to be true about Christianity. It also becomes very pivotal in understanding everything we know to be true about Islam, because there is only one God. Now, I love Elisa's analogy with the elephant and the mice, because this is so true. There's only one God to worship. We might express different qualities and characteristics of that God, but that doesn't change the fact that there's only one God. We may ascribe different qualities to God. We may see God in a different way, but that doesn't change the fact that there is only one God, only the Lord, and that we're supposed to love the Lord, the one God. There is only one God, that we're supposed to love the Lord with all of our heart, all of our being, and all of our strength. So from the three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we can all affirm this same thing together, that there is only one God, even though we describe that God differently, even though we worship that God in different ways. So in Islam, the way that they worship this God is different than the way that we worship this God, and they live that out through the 5 pillars of Islam. They've boiled this down. And so I want to walk through these with you today. Hopefully it'll give us an understanding, enrich our understanding of what Muslims believe, so that we can perhaps enrich our own faith a little bit more. So the 5 pillars of Islam. The first pillar is this profession of faith. Right? We're familiar with the profession of faith because we also have a profession of faith in Christianity. And this profession of faith begins with the same words from Deuteronomy. There is only one God. There is only one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. So I want to say a couple of clarifying things about this. When Muslims say God, they typically refer to God as Allah, which is the Arabic word for God. And don't get caught up in the language of God, right? Hispanic people use the word Dios for God. It's the same thing, different words of describing who God is. There is only one God, and it doesn't matter if we use the word Allah or Dios or God. We're still referring to the same God. But then they say Muhammad is his prophet. And so Muhammad was a prophet in Islam, and Muhammad was born in the 7th century, approximately 600 years after Jesus. Muhammad had this direct revelation from God. And in this direct revelation came the Quran. It was actually a word for word that the prophet Gabriel spoke, word for word, the Quran, and gave it to Muhammad. And Muhammad, as a result, began to preach this message of peace, this message of giving to the poor. And as a result of Muhammad's teaching, the religion of Islam came into being. And so this is the first pillar of Islam, that there is no God but God, which we also affirm, as we saw in Deuteronomy, and then that Muhammad is his prophet. The second pillar of Islam is that there's this prayer time that happens 5 times a day. Remember when I was in college, right, Bandar would get out his prayer rug and pray 5 times a day. And they do this by facing Mecca, and I'll talk about why Mecca is significant in a second. So they face towards Mecca 5 times a day to offer prayers to God. Now, for me, this was challenging. Bandar was praying 5 times a day, and I wasn't praying anything close to that. So it actually challenged me. I like a good competition, right? So it challenged me to really develop a more robust prayer life for myself. Because, if this is going to be one of their pillars, that they're going to commit to doing this 5 times a day, then certainly I should step up my prayer game. I should be in constant communication with God. I should be in this conversation with God that happens all the time. And so on this point, we're pretty close. We think that prayer, we believe in the power of prayer. We believe in this conversation that we're having with God. The next pillar of Islam is giving to the poor. And this is one of the pivotal things for understanding Islam, is that they really do believe in giving back. Now, they say somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5%. I don't know how they came up with that number, but that's what's expected for them to give back of their income. Whereas, we say a tithe, which represents 10%, is what we're aiming for. But the point is still there, right? We both agree that we should be giving back. We should be serving our community. We should be helping those that are in need. Now, this fourth one is a pilgrimage to Mecca, the fourth pillar of Islam, which is called a Hajj. Pilgrimage to Mecca. At some point in the life of every Muslim, they should make an attempt to get back, to go to Mecca. And we have a picture of this. It's called the Kaaba, this black rock. You might have seen pictures of this. And so particular times, there's crazy amounts of people that surround this thing, making their pilgrimage to Mecca. So a couple of things on this. So why is Mecca significant? Muhammad was born in Mecca. It kind of became the birthplace of the religion of Islam. And so that's important. But they actually trace this black rock all the way back to Ishmael and Abraham. This is where Abraham and Ishmael set up their camp. And as a result, Mecca became this holy city dating back not just a few hundred years, but thousands of years, all the way back to the time of Abraham, became this holy city. And then surrounding this Kaaba, this black rock that's here, is the mosque, where they go and they worship. So a pilgrimage becomes very important to them. A pilgrimage for us, certainly not, it's very important, but it's certainly not one of the things that I would say is mandatory for you. Having been to Israel, the Holy Land, twice, I would strongly encourage you that if you're able to do that, to make plans to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land at some point in your life, because it really can be this formational experience for you to be able to see the holy sites, to experience it for yourself. So we're not too different from them on this. And then certainly with the last point, the last pillar of Islam, this fasting that takes place. Muslims fast in the month of Ramadan. It's based on a lunar calendar, so it changes every year. But they fast during Ramadan, which is a month, they fast from sunup to sundown, every day during that month. What that does for them, it provides a way of sacrificing so that they're able to give more away during this time. But it also connects them with God in a powerful way. Now, we very rarely talk about fasting in the Methodist Church. Maybe some other churches do. But certainly it's important. It's important enough for Jesus to tell us when you fast, right? These are the ways that you should do it. Don't do it so that people are watching you, but fast in a way that draws you closer to God. So certainly these 5 pillars have a lot in common with some of the pillars that we believe to be true about Christianity. There are a lot of similarities between what Muslims practice and what Muslims believe, and what we practice and what we believe. But it wouldn't be fair to neither Islam or Christianity to minimize the differences between the two. So I don't want to do that. There's certainly beauty in both religions, and I don't want to minimize the differences between those two. I want to highlight some of those because I think it will help highlight some of the beauty. So Muslims actually believe that Jesus existed. They believe that Jesus was a prophet. They actually believe in the virgin birth. But from this point forward, we actually differ quite a bit about who Jesus was and the ways that Jesus carried out God's mission for his life. And to be clear, we as Christians don't believe that Jesus was just a prophet. We believe that Jesus is Lord. We don't believe that Jesus just did some nice things and said some wisdom teachings. We believe that Jesus died on the cross for our salvation. And we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. Those are pivotal and foundational points to what we believe. Our Christian worship is centered on and grounded in the reality that Christ died on the cross and was raised from the dead. Everything we do is because of that. Now, Muslims cannot affirm that. So there's some differences between what we worship and what they practice, because we believe everything that we worship comes from the actions and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and Muslims can't affirm that. However, there is only one God. We see this God differently. We talk about different attributes of this God. When Adam Hamilton is describing what his take on Islam, and I would encourage you, one of the great resources, certainly one that's helped me over the years, Adam Hamilton's book, Christianity and World Religions, is kind of a foundational book, and I think one of our small groups is actually walking through that right now. Emily helped teach it this summer, so she can be a resource as well. I would encourage you to take a look at this book because it really helps put into perspective our similarities and differences between other world religions. But when Adam, and I'll put a link maybe to that book on our Facebook website, or on Facebook and our website, so that you can find a link to that. But one of the things that Adam Hamilton says in this teaching on Islam, he uses the example of the Good Samaritan. It's a story that Jesus tells. It's a parable that Jesus tells. He says in this parable, Jesus highlights the differences between Samaritans and the Jews. And Adam says there's quite a few similarities between those differences between Samaritans and Jews, and today, Muslims and Christians. He says that Samaritans were considered other. They were considered different, yet they worshiped God. They had a different mountain, a different place to worship God, yet they believed in the same God as the Jews. We see in that text from John 4 that Samaritans worship here, you Jews worship over there. There's some differences, but they're subtle. And in that, then Jesus launches into this parable. And he tells that there was a priestly figure who's hurt. And then another priest walks by and says, well, I don't have time. I don't have time to help you. I'm sorry. And then another Levite walks by and said, sorry, I can't help you. I'm too busy. And then the Samaritan comes by. It's the Samaritan, this outcast, this other, that then helps the priest and actually helps him get better. So Adam Hamilton puts this into our context. He said if Jesus were telling this parable today, he would say there was a Methodist pastor that was walking from Jerusalem to Jericho, perhaps from Jerusalem to Mecca, and he was beat up and left for dead. And a Baptist preacher walked by and said, you know what? I can't help you. I'm sorry. And then a Presbyterian pastor walked by and said, I don't have enough time to help you. I'm sorry. And then a Muslim religious leader walked by and offered help to the Methodist preacher who was in need. See, when Jesus is asked the question, how do we love God? He says, what are the foundational things about who God is? Jesus says, love God and love our neighbor. He uses Deuteronomy over and over again. Every time that a scribe asks Jesus this question, how do you sum up the law and the prophets? What is the greatest commandment? Jesus answers from Deuteronomy. And he says, the greatest law is that there is only one God, and we should love him with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. The second commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. So when Jesus is giving this parable, this is the answer to the question of who is my neighbor. Jesus says it's the Samaritan that was more of a neighbor than the religious leaders. And Adam Hamilton would say it was the Muslim who was more of a neighbor than the religious leaders of our day. So what we can learn from this example, this parable, is that perhaps the other, or sometimes the other, can actually be more of a Christian, can be more of a neighbor than we are if we're failing to love our neighbor. What this comes down to for me, when answering this question, do we worship the same God, is can we love God together and can we love our neighbor? And if we can say yes to both of those questions, we're drawing ourselves closer to God's heart because that's who God is. That's foundational for our understanding of God because Jesus tells us, do these two things. There's two commandments, love God and love your neighbor. John sums it up this way in 1 John. Dear friends, let's love each other because love is from God. And everyone who loves is born from God and knows God. God is love. And those who remain in love remain in God, and God remains in them. Brothers and sisters, if we're able to love our neighbor, if we're able to love God, we'll remain in God's love. There is only one God. We assign different qualities and characteristics to who this God is. But if those qualities and characteristics are centered on and grounded in love, then we're worshiping the God of love. Let us pray. Loving God, the God who is one, we praise you for who you are. You're our good, good Father. And we love you. And we want to love our neighbors. And we find that difficult and challenging, and we don't always do that in ways that are pleasing to you. But you can show us how we can do that. Show us how we can love each other better. Because as a result, we might be models of your love here on earth. Allow us to reflect that love. So that we would continue to ask the question of who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor that we might show your love to them? We pray this in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.